I'll welcome everyone here. The topic of the hour is governance in a time of disruption, which seems like always. Boards everywhere are recognizing that today's environment is fundamentally different than even a year ago. And conscientious board members are wondering if there is or should be a change in how they discharge their responsibilities as board member. So let's talk about the landscape of the modern boardroom, key topics, AI, cyber risks, shifting economies, all the good stuff. So to kick us off, as usual, we're going to have Randall share a few words to get us thinking, and then we'll flip into questions from me and from you. First, a little bit about Randall for those who don't know him yet. He has founded several successful startups. He's held a long-time position at a Big Four consulting firm. He was a senior executive at an American public company, the author of 8 books, in the Speaker Hall of Fame, master facilitator. He's helped over 100 organizations scale, and he works with me at the Braintrust Professional Institute, helping organizations grow their businesses with executive coaching, leadership retreats, and facilitating conversations to align teams. So, Randall, start us off. In your view, what does board governance look like today for the modern board member?
So I recognize that a lot of people listening to this or who are here live probably come from different parts. So when we say governance, I think it's important just to recognize that there's a difference with respect to governance in not-for-profits versus for-profit organizations. I think there's a difference between governance in organizations that are really more startup oriented, if you will, or super small, where it's very much an operational board because maybe even isn't staff, it's volunteers, versus a mature board where it truly is just policy and they understand governance exceptionally well and their arms and legs in the management team. There's a committee structure, et cetera, in place to make sure the governance actually takes place. So with almost the two different dimensions, not for profit, profit between very much startup operational boards versus mature boards. What governance looks like in each of these, I want to recognize right from the start, is a little bit different. So that's number one. Number two, the question of, okay, we're living in a time of incredible change. What does this mean for governance? I guess just to say that every organization is different, but pretty much every single board should be thinking about, issues of risk, issues of you know, overseeing the control or the direction of the organization, etc., which typically involves doing and then being involved in one way or the other in a whole bunch of planning exercises. Okay, what is that overall strategy? What is that North Star, etc.? We sort of joked years ago in governance about, well, this isn't the Soviet Union with the or China with the 5-year plan where everything goes according to plan, and then we do another 5-year plan. And of course, we're doing things differently. We do strategic planning with a 3-year time frame with a 1-year kind of reset, double check, and everything. It's very difficult today to do long-term planning in a short-term world. There's so much, socio-geopolitical change that's happening. Almost every day, economically, there's something that's different that's happening. The underlying regulatory environment is changing. New risks, cybersecurity, new technologies like AI, etc., mean that it's very difficult to be thinking about this. Oh, I'm on the board. Okay, I could just relax and go to this quarterly meeting and job is done. That kind of mindset definitely needs to be retired. I think most credible organizations and most diligent board members have never sort of had that attitude. But what they do have is an issue of saying, well, if we're just doing pure oversight, how do we deal with all this massive change? And so I've got a whole bunch of ideas. I want to make sure we get some of the questions and answers on that one. But no, it's not business as usual. It just can't be. But I'll also say that it's not reactionary times. It's not let's kind of run around in a crazy way because, quote, everything's different, right? Perhaps the cadence has changed, but the world is not ending here. We got through COVID, right? We got through a whole bunch of other changes over the years before, and we will also get through any of the issues that are happening today as well. But maybe we need to think about them a bit differently.
I want to start by talking about AI in the boardroom. and how AI is impacting board members and governance. And maybe for those that are still trying to catch up, do you want to speak to this, Randall?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I, I've given a number of presentations on AI, and all I can say is that it is changing every single day. The technologies are changing. The players are actually changing. Every day there's new players in the space. Every piece of software has got an AI layer. They're advertising it. Sometimes there is an AI layer, sometimes not. But this is fundamentally changing the nature of how businesses operate. And I'm not talking about just about using AI from a workflow process improvement perspective. Let's sort of cut down the amount of time it takes to go through a particular workflow. But it's also opening up some fascinating new strategic avenues for organizations to play in. Can they disintermediate an entire suite of suppliers? Can they move into customer space in a way that's a bit different? Is the whole product development cycle suddenly, I want to say, superpowered by AI, but perhaps it can be done in a different way? Perhaps there's ways that the strategy, we used to always think of, well, here's the strategy, and from the strategy comes the HR strategy and the IT strategy and the supply chain strategy and all the other strategies that get, developed underneath. And by the way, in technology, but perhaps for the first time, AI and which is, technology, if you will, maybe that's not just something that one does under a strategy. Um, Maybe that's actually having an impact on the strategy itself, right? And maybe this is one of those inflection points in an organization where we say, okay, so here we go. And by the way, this brings up an interesting question. If, for example, you're going to have on the board somebody who, typically it's always people who've got general leadership experience. They've done it before. They might have some degree of general knowledge shifting into a particular industry or particular subject. But for things like AI, for things like cyber security, do you have to shift the who you actually recruit for the board to have subject matter expertise, not just, for example, general leadership knowledge, okay, or corporate expertise, or whatever it is that you're doing. And I think that's an interesting one because when the board thinks about what does this mean strategically, how to go about executing an AI strategy, and let's face it, if you get a consultant in to give you the strategy, 2, 3 months later, I think it might be done, right? It might be done. It's no longer up to date. So having the knowledge literally on site within the board itself, I think is got to be something that boards consider. I'd also say that the question of using scenario planning as part of the structural strategy sort of review has got to go up to that next level, right? Because we've always talked about the need to do some scenario planning during strategic planning because, what if this, what if that, what if the other? But, particularly because of AI, because of the massive changes in the geopolitical world, et cetera, the idea of saying, okay, well, it's not just scenario planning light, but let's actually go deeper into some of these different directions and say, what does this mean? What could this mean? And I think it's very exciting, right? Because it's no longer saying, here's the plan, here's the 3 year plan, or here's the 1 year plan, but living uh, doing long-term planning in the short-term world is just very difficult, right? And it has impacts on who's on the board and how the board operates. So.
I heard the argument made that a trained GPT can offer better advice than a boardroom of 8 to 10 board members with finite experience and more than enough ego. Can indeed a chat GPT replace the value and contribution of a board? Or what unique value do the flesh and blood board members bring to the table?
Oh man. So I don't know. Like I sit on public company board, I sit on private company boards, I sit on not-for-profit boards, okay. And I'm thinking about, Chat Randall Craig sitting there around the board table. I've been in situations, certainly in the last several years, where as an independent board member, in where I've had to represent the interests of those minority shareholders, for example. I just am not so sure, for example, that the current chat GPT kind of paradigm can actually do that job. It does know to say, hold on 1 second here, that's not exactly true. Or you know something, no, I can't vote for this or vote against that because such and such. Really, right now, and we're really right now, we're on the cusp in the AI space of moving from a chatbot related text interface where you ask it a question and it responds or it draws something or it connects something rather to something called agentic AI, agent, agentic AI. An agentic AI is where an AI will function as if it were you, presumably programmatically doing a bunch of stuff as if it were you. Okay. So, for example, you could speak to your agent and say, oh, look up on the website such and such, grab the data, put it into a spreadsheet, munge it around in a certain way, and then put together in Word, put together a report that describes what it's all about. Okay. Call it Agentic AI 1.0. The idea of having an agent AI, if you will, that's actually sitting in the boardroom around, or instead of, I should say, an actual person with deeper experience and the group dynamic that a healthy board actually can have. I think that's a number of years in the future. Where I do see this actually interesting, once there's some degree of agentic AI, is to say, how might we use this to improve the governance process itself? How might we use this, for example, to help a particular board member better do some of their do their duties? And I think that's very promising. I just don't think it's there right now. Right now, on the other hand, what you could do as a board member is you could feed some things into an AI, excuse me, and then you can say do some analysis and give it back, right? And this is fascinating as long as you know what to ask it to do, right? But if you don't know what you don't know, it's very hard to get it to. Of course, you can say, AI, please, chat GPT, please tell me what I need to know. And then you say, okay, now I want to ask you that question. But putting that aside, as long as there's certain controls around it, for example, that what you feed into the AI not um, is not going to be used for training data, that there's appropriate firewalls around the data so that it doesn't go outside, a particular area. That's okay. Recently, I'll give you an example. We're looking at financial statements. Okay, very, very detailed financial statements, along with like dozens of pages of notes to the financial statements. And then we've got another document, which is dozens of pages, which is management discussion and analysis. And for me to go through every single thing in each of those and say, gee, I wonder if there's any discrepancies. That would take many, many hours, which of course in the past, that's what you would have to do. So being able to feed both of these very, very big detailed documents into I use Claude in this particular case and say, please highlight any of the differences or any risks that are highlighted in one, not highlighted in the other. And out comes an analysis of 10 points, which at that point I can then, as somebody who's knows a bit about these things, can actually go through and say, okay, no, that's not an issue. Up, this one absolutely is. Up, this one is. So using AI to help me as a director is a different kind of role than having agentic AI replace me as a director. I think that the question of how do we go about using AI for the purposes of oversight or board operations or board management relationships, etc. If we're talking with an executive director, a CEO, sitting on the board, you want to actually be talking to them because you're not only sort of getting a sense as to what the plans are for the organization, but you're also in the back of your mind, they're on trial, right? You have to think about is this CEO up to the are they strong enough to take the organization through the next period of time? How are they doing relative to whatever the KPIs are that we actually set with them? Do we still have trust in that CEO, right? Or is this something that we need to sort of stick our noses in a little bit more, or have a committee look into a little bit more, or where do they need more support, et cetera? Having AI sort of interposed in that means that we might not be able to have those authentic, real conversations between the board and the CEO, executive director. So helper, not replacement.
Acknowledging that Randall does not have a crystal ball, but you have sat on boards for many decades. Looking ahead to the next 5, 10 years, do you have a vision or a forecast for how board operations or board focus will be different?
Oh boy. And I just have to say, to everybody, I don't I probably should have predicted it, but I don't get the questions from Rania or from anyone else who's actually on these calls beforehand. So, prediction, I would say this. I think that the whole question of board and governance training is exceptionally important. Exceptionally important. I don't know how many people read this book. Direct, I'll just show you how thick it is. Directors' duties in Canada, or any of the other, legislative frames and everything around how to be a board member, what the duties are. It doesn't happen by osmosis, right? What kind of training do the directors actually have? What's the onboarding approach for any new director? What are some of the conversations that have to have that speak to ensuring that there's a collegial but professional but accountability oriented conversation that actually happens around the boardroom table and beyond that makes the board functioning. So I think that we can never, ever get enough of that. And I think that the better organizations recognize that whether it's formal training and board governance that both Rania and myself have, or whether it's excuse me, or whether it's the School of Hard Knocks that some people have, but you bring in people to either outsiders to facilitate or train the board, okay, or some other mechanism. But that's something that's not going to change. But your question, Rania, is, well, what do you think is going to change? So, I guess one of the things that I would say that's fascinating to me, and things go in and out of style. And we like to think when something comes in of style, and before it goes out of style, some of the stuff that it brings in style sticks with it. And a great example is the whole ESG movement, right? And there's a lot in there that's good. But certainly over the last year or so, the bloom's been off the rose because of organizations getting themselves in trouble for making or not making social or political commentary. So a lot of organizations, certainly in the not-for-profit space, are saying, well, we want to be politically neutral. Okay, we're not commenting on the social, issues of the day, right? And so I'm not saying that's a good decision, a bad decision, but I'm pointing out that on one hand, we're subscribing to ESG concepts. On the other hand, there's policies coming out saying, well, I think we're going to be politically neutral, and we're not going to be saying these things, and we're not going to take positions and everything. And I think it's a very interesting dynamic, right? That maybe the boards might want to talk about, right? I think the whole question about the impact of geopolitical shifting, whether it's China's ascendancies or Russia's imperialistic ambitions, or our American friends who are battening down the hatches with an American first policy, or what's happening in Europe, or what's happening in, we haven't talked about Africa, or the other parts of Asia, India, for example, Southeast Asia. But there's an awful lot that's happening that's making change. Certainly from a supply chain perspective, things are very different from where you sell stuff to, and that's very, very different. Um, the various governments are making a lot of changes at the time of the recording of this session. It's drying up an awful lot of investment. People are not sure about whether they want to invest when there's all this uncertainty, right? So the question from a board perspective is, okay, if we meet quarterly, for example, or if we meet bi-monthly, is the standard agenda that we typically have had, is that standard agenda doesn't need to change? Do we need to meet or have a committee of the board meet on a more frequent basis? Do we need to sort of develop some additional committees that might focus in on, perhaps with management, perhaps not, on specific topics that are of interest specifically to the board, right? And cybersecurity is one of them, for example. AI we talked about earlier is another. The whole geopolitical issues, that's another, right? But do we need to say we need to find a way that parts of the board can more quickly get up to speed on some of these things, so they could bring that knowledge to the board as a whole. I think the use of technology is also an area of huge change. So, for example, what's the platform that the board actually operates on? Is there, for example, and we've had for many years, certainly in more sophisticated organizations, portals so that the management team and can sort of see where things were going on different KPIs or balanced scorecard. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it, but maybe some of that data, appropriate amounts of that data, can be shown to the board. Okay, based on what the board's interested in seeing, so it can have a little bit more real time, right? I think the whole question of digital preparation for the boards is an interesting one. And here we're as digital and cloud-based as you could imagine. Ronnie and I and our colleagues were all about less paper and more digital and always there and always available. But here's an interesting thing. As a board member, okay, to get a note saying all these things have now been uploaded into the portal. Gee, here's an email with a whole bunch of PDFs and spreadsheets. Gee, here's such and such, right? Sometimes I wish we were back in the olden days. It's embarrassing for me to say this, where somebody would courier me a binder with everything where I can actually go through and scratch out, scratch, scratch, scratch. Okay. But instead, and you can't see it here, but just behind me is a printer where I got to print out a lot of this stuff. Why? Because I make a lot of notes on them. And it's a lot harder to do that digitally. So I think sometimes, our rush to digitize everything might take away from what the individual board members may need. And don't get me wrong, everything goes on my tablet. I take notes on them, so that's what I end up doing when I'm getting PDFs, from the boards I sit on. But it's just a question of at what point do we say the efficiency of the information? Let's give people portals where they can and dashboards where they could see stuff versus the practical. How do you make it so that it's easier for them actually to do the oversight work that they need to do? It's just another interesting board operational challenge that I think that we need to get our minds around because we've been going into the let's do everything digitally for years now. And I don't know if we've really talked about it as much as and by the way, I don't want the binder back with it takes so much time to to uh, to reproduce. I just think there should be a conversation.
Let's talk about checks and balances and proper boundaries on the board. Okay, number one, CEO as chair or the independent chairman. Okay, do you think this should be like avoided, or might there be circumstances where either situation might be appropriate or inappropriate?
So I've been on boards where the chairwoman was incredibly talented. Okay, I've been in ones where
And
they
she was the CEO, you're saying?
no, 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 no. But the need of actually having the separation was very, very clear because the role of the chair and the job of the chair, the only time where I could say I've seen the chair and the CEO be the same is I sat on a startup like board years and years ago, right? And guess what? The chair was the CEO because the CEO was the majority shareholder, right? It was not a sophisticated board. Okay, and this person just didn't want to, give up power, right? They just felt that this is my company. In a certain sense, it's like, well, why do you have a board then, right? How do you do good governance if you've got the roles exactly the same, right? And so, no, without a question, it's got to be separate. Okay, at a certain point, except for the extreme startup. Same thing with the smallest charities or professional associations. Sometimes, okay, but in those ones, you've got a different dynamic, right? You've got the all the volunteers, which are typically sitting on the board, right? And you've got the professional staff who are over here, right? And if you've got the president who's also the chair of the board, sometimes it's convenient because they're an outsider and because of the stage of maturity that board is in. But you can always do better from governance if you separate the roles. Always, always.
Randall, you mentioned CEO as chair, as the majority shareholder. Let's talk about board members as investors. When all board members are investors in the company, or perhaps some have invested more heavily than others, how does this impact the dynamics?
So, I think most people who understand the basics of governance recognize that every single director who's sitting on the board, including the majority shareholder, is a director for everybody. And they're not a director for their private interests, right? They have a fiduciary responsibility under law to make sure that they're actually um, governing the organization for everybody. The role of the independent director sort of is call it the insurance policy to make sure that that's actually happening. But no, this is a duty. They lay themselves open to legal recourse if, for example, they're not maintaining their fiduciary responsibility. So, there could be some big investors, there could be smaller investors. And I think everybody who's on the board, they need to literally, and I'm talking about for-profit organizations and certainly public companies, but you always have to kind of audition for yourself every time you open your mouth that you're going to say something that's intelligent, that's going to move the conversation forward, right? That you're not saying something because you're maybe not as courageous as you should be. You've got a role to to do here. Listen, and you have to make sure, frankly, that you're not hogging the conversation, right? And a good chair makes sure that all the perspectives um, are considered, right? It's a conversation around the board table on all these issues that has the huge value, right? So.
Let's talk compensation. Some boards members are compensated, other boards do not compensate their board members. How does the compensation impact the board itself? And do you think it impacts professionalism one way or the other?
So I've certainly know a lot of not-for-profits who compensate the board members, okay, because of what's required. And I know a lot of not-for-profits who specifically don't, just because they want people who truly are volunteers and not, quote, motivated by a few extra dollars in their pocket. In the corporate world, it's not reasonable to expect people to be on the board with no compensation, right? But the question of when does the compensation happen? And is a big one. So, for example, a startup that has no money is likely not going to be paying anybody cash because every dollar that goes into the director's pockets is a dollar away from actually investing in whatever that's going to grow. So, in that particular case, you'll typically do it with RSUs, restricted stock units, or options or shares. Okay, and those would typically vest over a period of time, often 3 years, sometimes two. And so that the value that the board adds is the value that's actually is actually being paid out, as opposed to, gee, here's the big payday for just being appointed to a board. I also think that it's not unreasonable to say, well, you know what, we should do a per meeting fee, right? And the per meeting fee is just to recognize that your time has got some value. And sometimes that's a very nominal amount just to say, yeah, okay, tick. And sometimes it's a slightly bigger amount, recognizing how much preparation there is. Typically in a corporate board, there's a number of different committees that a board member has to sit on as well. Typically, sitting on a committee is considered to be part of the board duties, if you will, that are compensated by whatever the stipend or whatever the shares might happen or RSUs or options might happen to be. Um, but the duty of the chair of each of these committees might be very different. So, for example, the chair of the audit committee is a massive, massive job. It's not reasonable for that person not to be paid an extra chunk just for that, right? But once again, for the smallest of startups, it's going to be a very different scale than, say, a large organization. If you look at the big banks, interestingly, they have their directors are paid, about $250,000 thereabouts, 180 $250,000, because it's a very significant role. For startups and everything, you're not going to get much of anything. Why? Because there's no money, right? But you think that there's something there. So that's why you're there. I'll also say, by the way, there's a difference in board members, and this is a basic of governance. Certainly on the corporate side, if you're going to stack the board with all of your friends and family, are they really going to give you the advice that you need? Right? Are they going to ask the tough questions, even if they are qualified? And that speaks to the issue of how do you recruit the best prospective more board members there? What's the rubric, for example, that you're using to say, here are the skills we happen to need? What's the recruitment mechanism you use to find and source potential candidates that might fit within the rubric one way or the other? And what's the mechanism to take people who have served and have done a very good job and rotate them off? And not in a negative sense. It's just that a board member, for example, at one of those more early stage operational boards might not be the same board member and might not be equipped to be that board member when it's going public, right? And that might not be the same board member when it becomes a multinational, hundreds of millions of dollars organization. They're built differently, right? So what are the governance mechanisms you have to deal with the issues of succession planning, rotations, board evaluation, board member evaluation, and board comp? So good question.
Many board members have held the role of organizational leader or are still in that role, right, as CEO or other title at the top of the food chain. So, as organizational leaders, they are used to rolling up their sleeves, making things happen. But as a board member, the function and mentality is very different. Many people have spoken about this issue, but maybe I want to hear the Randall Craig opinion. Can you speak to the mental switching that has to happen for those, CEO, the govern versus the governance mentality? I've heard it described as the transition between, going from parent to grandparent. Thoughts?
Parent to grandparent. I hadn't heard that one, but I think it's pretty cool. So what I would say is this. If the people who are sitting around the board are sophisticated investors, if they're, CEOs in their own right, or in other leadership roles, they're probably very busy people, right? Very, very, very busy people. And the best board governance processes recognize that and do whatever they can to make sure that their time is being used most effectively. From the other side, it's very simple. An operating CEO running their organization, whether it's a $100 million organization or more, whether it's a startup, whether it's $1 billion organization or more, they do not have extra cycles. And the fact that they're sitting on a board means that they think that that role is important enough to actually push out something else from the rest of their time, right? Whether it's family or exercise or other community work or their own professional responsibilities. So, at least in my personal experience, I've never seen a situation where, and I'm sure other people may have seen this, but where a board member says, golly darn, I just have so much extra time. I think I want to roll up my sleeves and really just get in there because, gee, my day job just doesn't have me busy enough. I know I'm being sarcastic a little bit, but I just haven't seen that. What I have seen though is when you realize that the CEO or somebody on the CEO's leadership team needs a little bit of extra help, with a little bit of you know um, the whole question we talked about earlier about, gee, is it general leadership type people who are on the board, or is it people who've got some subject matter expertise? So I know a little bit about strategy and marketing strategy. I certainly know a lot about technology. I know a lot about a bunch of other things as well. So, sitting on a board and the CEO says, something, we wouldn't mind. We're thinking of doing a rebrand. You got some time. We're struggling with something. So the answer for me is, yeah, absolutely, let's find a time, right? So fine, we could take an hour of time and we could sort of talk through it, and I'm able to provide that kind of that kind of input for the CEO. So that's very different than me as a board member or anybody as a board member saying, okay, I think there's a challenge for me not to jump in, right? We're just too busy. I'll also say something else, just on the topic of, where does that CEO get their support? Um, I think that between the two poles of the truly operational startup board and the very, very large, sophisticated, uh, um, very sophisticated board, there's a lot of gray zone in between, right? And if we think about where they actually get their support, there's certainly a very powerful relationship that has to exist between the chair of the board and the CEO or executive director. We've already talked about that one-on-one kind of relationship between individual board members and the CEO, where the CEO can just call up the board member and just ask a question or two. I think the CEO's support team must be their management team, the people that they've hired that report to them, that are responsible for executing all the strategy, but below the CEO. And I also think sometimes, the CEO, the better ones anyway, they've got a business coach, somebody who's kind of outside, who's able to whisper in their ear and maybe ask tough questions, or work through, things, particularly when they get something from the board that they are not exactly sure about, but they can't go back to the board and say, I'm not exactly sure about. It's not fully baked enough to go back to their team, right? And they just need um, they need some additional processing time, okay, or an external CPU, if you will, to help move this along. By the way, external CPU, I'm not talking about ChatGPT, right? I'm talking about a code. So there's a whole bunch of different support structures that could be in place to um, make them successful.
Randall, if I'm understanding you correctly, and that you're saying you haven't seen other board members get overly involved, I would say your experience has been unique, or this is over discussed in the public view. I don't know what to make of it, but there is an expression, noses in, noses out, fingers in, fingers out. Like, what does that look like to you? Noses in, fingers in, if not over involvement? With that, we're going to break right here, this part one on our Q&A on modern board governance. We will pick up with more Q&A in part two, but if anything we talked about so far resonates with you, if you're looking to bring people in to come do training for your board at your next retreat, or do a board workshop, do reach out. Happy to talk to you about our work that we do, coaching board chairs and CEOs. Do reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation and share resources. info@randallcraig.com, or book a call at www.randallcraig.net/30, and see you back for part two.